Okay everyone, in today's lecture video, we're going to cover Chapter 7, which is the axial skeleton. So we just finished up Chapter 6, which talked about all of the mechanics of bone, and now in Chapter 7 we're going to start looking at the skeleton as a whole articulated entity, and we're also going to talk about some of the ways that we can split up our skeleton, and we can divide our skeleton into different groups. So we have two major divisions of the skeletal system, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Chapter 7 will compose the bones of the axial skeleton, and Chapter 8 will compose the bones of the appendicular skeleton. So the major regions of the skeleton that compose the axial skeleton are the skull, the bones of the thoracic cage, and the vertebral column. Those are the major parts that make up the axial skeleton. So this slide is just showing us a little bit of review from Chapter 6 and talking about some of the skeletal system's function as a whole. The skeletal system serves a lot of functions, and some of those are protection and storage of certain substances. The axial skeleton especially provides protection for a lot of our visceral organs, such as the brain. The brain is protected by the bones of the cranium. The bones that make up the skull wrap around the brain and form a vault by which the brain can sit. The vertebrae bones are going to wrap around the spinal cord and protect that very important nervous system structure. And the bones of the thoracic cage, namely the ribs, are wrapping around the heart and the lungs to provide a nice cage for them to sit within. So on top of serving as a surface area for muscle attachments, the skeletal system is also serving a protective role as well. And one of the things that we discussed in the last class as well is how our bone serves a storage function. So bones store and release calcium, and that's a major player in calcium homeostasis. Our bone is our body's major calcium reservoir. 99% of our body's calcium can be found within bones. And so when our blood calcium levels go too low or too high, we're going to either break down some of the bone matrix and release that into the blood, or we're going to deposit new bone matrix to support more bones. So this slide is just a review from what we covered in Chapter 6. Specifically today in Chapter 7, we're going to discuss the divisions of the skeleton, and more specifically, we're going to go over the axial skeleton. So the skeleton as a whole is made up of 206 bones, and we can separate those bones into two groups. The axial skeleton is the first group, which will contain 80 bones, and the appendicular skeleton is the second group, and it will contain 126 bones. So I'll just say one more time, the major regions of the axial skeleton are the bones of the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. And there are a lot of bones that can be found within each of those regions. So there are many bones that make up the skull, and you will go over these in your lab class in great detail. There are many types of ribs on either side of the body, which will all eventually articulate with the sternum through costal cartilage. And we'll also have a lot of vertebrae that are going to stack upon one another, and that's going to make up our protective vertebral column. So these are what we're going to cover in Chapter 7 today. The appendicular skeleton we will see in the next video for Chapter 8. So this slide just shows you a highlighted version of what the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton are. And so on the left side, we can see the axial skeleton with the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage, and all of those bones that are going to make up the axial skeleton for a grand total of 80. So the skull has a lot of bones that compose it. There are different bones that can be found around the cranium as well as on the face. So we're going to be going over the axial skeleton in pretty great detail tonight, so I'm not going to focus too much on these on this slide, but I just wanted to show you this highlighted version of the axial skeleton. And one of the other things I wanted to use this slide to show you is that we also have a special bone known as the hyoid bone that can be found within this axial skeleton. This hyoid bone is the one free-floating bone in the body, and it can be found in the upper throat. When I say that this bone is free-floating, that means it does not articulate with any other bones. So the hyoid bone is a very special bone. The auditory ossicles are another group of bones that we will see in the skull. There are 3 of these on each side of the skull. The auditory ossicles are 3 bones that can be found in the middle ear cavity. And these will help to transmit sound signals from the external environment into our 8th cranial nerve that will give us hearing information. And I will discuss the appendicular skeleton in Chapter 8. So I just posted this slide for your study purposes. This is a very, very nice slide. This has this link on it that will take you to your Wiley Plus material that will give you the ability to see some of these structures in some models. So this is a resource for all of you to look and learn the axial and appendicular skeletons. So before we jump into the specific bones that we find in our bodies, we're going to briefly discuss the different types of bones and the ways that we classify bones. We classify bones based on their shape, and we have 5 classifications of bones that we can give. Long bones, which we heavily discussed in chapter 6, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, and sesamoid bones. Most of the bones in our bodies can be classified into one of these groups fairly simply based on the way that it looks. So let's do a brief introduction on each of these types of bones. Long bones, as we discussed in chapter 6, are going to be longer than they are wide. However, that's not the only characteristic of long bones. Long bones will have 2 epiphyses at either end as well as a diaphysis. If it doesn't have an epiphysis and a diaphysis, it is not considered a long bone. We will also have short bones, which can often be found in the wrist and in the ankles. These are going to have the same width side, so they're going to be fairly cube-shaped. Flat bones will appear rather flat. They're going to have a nice plate, and these bones can be found in the cranium as well as our ribs. Ribs are a sort of confusing type of bone that might strike you as a long bone because it is in fact longer than it is wide. However, ribs are considered flat bones. Irregular bones are any type of bones that don't fit into one of these other categories. So the bones of the vertebrae and the coxal bones are going to be some irregular bones we see throughout the body. And lastly, sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones are named because these bones are enveloped in some type of tendon. The best and biggest example of a sesamoid bone in our bodies is the patella. The patella is the bone that makes up the kneecap. And this bone on either side is attached to our muscles through what is known as the patellar tendon. So this is going to be found here in this region. So these are major types of bones. Again, these are based on their shape. We classify bones based on the way that they look. And most of these are fairly intuitive. So that will take us into the specific bones of our axial skeleton. Remember, I'll say once more that the axial skeleton is made up of the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. Now, many of these bones you will learn in your lab class. Your lab class is meant to really discuss the individual bones and how they articulate and such. So in the lecture class, I really want you guys to be focusing on the names of each of these bones as well as what other bones they articulate with. So the skull has 22 bones within it, some found on the cranium, some found in the face. Now, this does not include the 3 ear ossicles that can be found in both ears. So if we were to include all 6 ear ossicles that we have, we would actually have a total of 28 bones that can be found in the skull. And as you will learn in your lab, there are many different projections and depressions that can be found within the bones of our skulls. Bones will often have a lot of physical characteristics, and we give each one its own name. So I will not be harping on the specific bones of the skull in this lecture class. Like I said, I just want you to understand the bones that make up the axial skeleton. I want you to understand how the skull will articulate with the vertebral column, and I will discuss that in just a few slides. So next up is the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is the one free-floating bone in our bodies. So this is the one bone that has no other articulation with any other bone. And that's what makes this bone very special. The hyoid bone is really offering a surface area for a lot of muscles that can be found in the neck and in the pharynx. This muscle is going to support the tongue, and it will also help us to swallow. So the hyoid bone is this one special free-floating bone, and it can be found here in the upper part of the throat. The next major region of the axial skeleton we're going to cover is the vertebral column. Now, the bones that make up the vertebral column are known as vertebrae. These bones will nicely stack on each other, and in between each bone we're going to have a layer of fibrocartilage known as the intervertebral discs. So we'll see this cartilaginous structure in between each vertebral bone. Now in total, there are 26 vertebrae that make up the vertebral column. We have 7 cervical vertebrae, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and we have 5 lumbar vertebrae. Now, in total, that's 24. And we also have the 2 bones that can be found at the base of the vertebral column, so the sacrum and the coccyx. The sacrum is a series of 5 fused vertebrae that sits at the base of the vertebral column and will allow for the 2 coxal bones to come in and articulate. And the coccyx is another series of fused vertebrae that can be found at the base here, and this is often referred to as the tailbone. So each vertebrae is going to form a little hole, or what is known as a foramen, that's running through our bone. And that is where the spinal cord can be found within the vertebral column. The spinal cord will project down this column through the vertebral canal, and this is going to allow the spinal cord to have some protection as it sits in this portion of the body. As I mentioned before, each vertebral bone is going to stack on each other, and they're going to form this nice long channel that allows for the spinal cord to run through. Now, the vertebral column, on top of having different regions, such as the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions, we're also going to have different curvatures that can be found within our spinal column. So we'll have a cervical curve, a thoracic curve, a lumbar curve, and a sacral curve. And each of these are going to sort of run in opposite directions as the ones next to them. So the cervical curve, you can see, is sort of bowing out in this direction, while the thoracic curve is bowing out in this direction. And this is very important. In the fetus, the spinal column is C-shaped. This is a C-shaped spinal column. But as we age and we grow older, two of these curves are going to actually bend in the opposite direction, namely the cervical curve and the lumbar curve. And this is what sets up our understanding of primary versus secondary curves. Primary curves are any curve that existed in the fetal spine. Secondary curves are any curve that formed after birth. So specifically, the cervical curve gives us the ability to raise our head, and the lumbar curve gives us the ability to stand up straight. So both of these are going in the opposite directions and are named secondary curves because they developed after birth. Here's another slide for you all to use as a study purpose. These slides are going to be scattered throughout your presentation, so you can use these as you go. Our next region is the thorax. The thorax is made up of the rib bones, the sternum, and the costal cartilages that connect those two bones. So you can see that each rib is actually going to be found over here, and it's going to stop at this region, and costal cartilage will project from those bones and insert into this sternum bone. So this here is the sternum, and each rib is going to be found on either side. The sternum has three parts to it: this upper portion, this center portion, and this lower portion. The upper portion is known as the manubrium, and it serves as a place for our clavicle to articulate. Both of the clavicles, or the collarbones, are going to come in and articulate with the manubrium. The manubrium attaches to this other bony portion in the center, which is referred to as the body of the sternum, which can also be called the gladiolus. And the xiphoid process is going to be this portion that can be found down here. Now, there are 12 ribs that can be found in the thoracic cage on each side. We have true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. The first 7 ribs are going to be true ribs because they will contain their own costal cartilage. And each of these first 7 ribs are going to attach to the sternum through their own costal cartilage. So again, the costal cartilage is what connects our ribs and our sternum. We also have 3 false ribs, 8, 9, and 10. These will all have their costal cartilage connecting to the sternum through the 7th costal cartilage. And lastly, we'll have floating ribs, which are 11 and 12, which do not connect with the sternum by any costal cartilage. So here we can see the sternum. Again, I want you to focus on how these bones articulate with one another. So the manubrium that can be found here at the top will articulate with both the body of the sternum as well as the 2 clavicles. Those clavicles will come in and articulate at the clavicular notch. And on either side of the manubrium we'll have a clavicular notch, one for each clavicle. So below the manubrium we're going to attach to the body of the sternum, and then below the body of the sternum we will find the xiphoid process. And you can see there are these ridges found in the side of the sternum where each costal cartilage is going to be allowed to insert. So these are 3 different parts of one bone named the sternum. Now, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, we have 12 pairs of ribs. So in total, that means we have 24 ribs, because these are pairs, and 12 ribs can be found on either side of the thoracic cage. Now, ribs serve a wonderful protective function, as well as offering structural support to the thoracic cavity. The ribs will keep the thoracic cavity open and allow that space to be contained within this part of our bodies. So I also mentioned that we have 3 types of ribs: true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. Again, our first 7 pairs attach directly to the sternum through their own costal cartilage. These are true ribs. If they have their own costal cartilage, they are true ribs. Our false ribs are going to be the next 3 pairs, ribs 8, 9, and 10. These three are going to attach indirectly to the sternum through the 7th costal cartilage. And once again, you can see from this picture that these 8, 9, and 10 will come up and insert into the 7th costal cartilage, and that's how these will connect with the sternum. The last 2 pairs of ribs are our floating ribs, and these will not connect to the sternum in any way through any costal cartilage. So there's only going to be 10 sets of costal cartilage, and there will be 12 sets of ribs. Now the ribs are going to be attaching to the costal cartilages, with the exception of rib 11 and 12. But all of our other ribs are going to have an end to attach to costal cartilage, and another end known as the vertebral end, because this end will articulate with the vertebrae. And in fact, each rib is going to articulate twice with every vertebrae that we see. And so I really like this picture down here, because this shows us how one rib will come in to the vertebral bone, and not only will it be inserting right here to contact this vertebrae, but it will also insert right here. So there are 2 points of articulation with every rib that can contact every single vertebrae. So there are 2 points of contact between our ribs and our vertebrae. And one of the other things that we can see with our vertebrae is that we have this nice central hole. And this hole will allow for the spinal cord to progress through. So if we took a lot of these vertebrae and stacked them on top of each other, we'd have a canal, essentially, because all of these different holes would be in the same plane, and that spinal cord would be allowed to project in through this canal. So again, in summary for ribs, each rib is going to attach twice to every vertebrae and also to its own costal cartilage, as long as we're not talking about ribs number 11 and 12. Now lastly for chapter 7 are some disorders. The first disorder we're going to discuss is a herniated disc. Remember, I said that between every vertebral bone, we're going to have some type of intervertebral disc that's made up of fibrocartilage. And each one of these discs has its own anatomical structures. So around the outside, we have this fibrocartilaginous region known as the annulus fibrosus. And then we have this other region in the center known as the nucleus pulposus. A herniated disc refers to the leakage of the nucleus pulposus into the vertebral canal, which is where the spinal cord is going to be found. So when the nucleus pulposus is leaking into this region, this is going to cause the compression of the spinal cord in this region, which can agitate the spinal cord. The spinal cord is one of our major tracts that bring different nerve signals from our bodies up to our brains. And so this is going to cause potentially a lot of pain and a lot of disruption to our body if we have one of these herniated discs. So this is the first of the axial skeleton pathologies that we're going to discuss. The last 3 all are related to our spinal curvatures. Remember, I said we have primary curves and we have secondary curves. So each of these disorders are irregular curvatures that we can find in the spine. Our 3 spinal curvature disorders are scoliosis, kyphosis, and lordosis. So all of these disorders refer to some type of exaggeration in any of our curves. So first up is scoliosis. Scoliosis is any type of exaggerated lateral curvature. The spinal column is supposed to sit nice and straight and have very normal primary and secondary curvatures. And when one of those curvatures is bent to the side or pronounced a little too much, that can cause a lot of pain as well. So scoliosis is any type of curvature that bows the spinal column out to either side. Kyphosis, on the other hand, is an exaggerated thoracic curve. And this causes the characteristic hunchback appearance. So kyphosis is when our thoracic curve is bent too much, and that pushes our upper portion of our body forward. Lordosis is our last irregular curvature, and this refers to an irregular lumbar curvature. So this causes the spinal column to bend backwards. Again, if this is accentuated enough, this can cause a lot of pain. So each of these conditions is shown here on this slide. Scoliosis refers to a lateral curvature. So again, our vertebral column is supposed to be straight. This is supposed to be found within the midline of our body. So it can cause a lot of pain and a lot of other issues if this is bent out to the side. So you can clearly see that this individual has pretty exaggerated scoliosis to the right side. And this is occurring in that thoracic curve. Kyphosis is showing us an irregular thoracic curve, where this thoracic curve is bent forwards. So we have this hunchback appearance, and there's going to be too much of a bowing of our thoracic curve towards the back. This is kyphosis. And lordosis refers to an exaggerated lumbar curvature. So you can see that this lumbar curvature is very, very accentuated. So this is lordosis. Now I have a little trick for you all to remember each of these types of curvatures. Lordosis that starts with an L is going to refer to an irregular lumbar curvature. Lumbar starts with an L and so does lordosis. So that's going to indicate what this condition refers to. Scoliosis starts with an S, and that's what the spinal column is going to look like when we have scoliosis. So this is going to bow out to either side and produce this S-shaped spinal cord. Kyphosis, I'm sorry guys, I don't have anything exciting about kyphosis, but by process of elimination, you can mark off scoliosis and you can mark off lordosis, and that will leave you with our last condition, which is kyphosis. So that will conclude Chapter 7's lecture video. I will see you all in the next video to cover Chapter 8.